Right, it's my pleasure to welcome back David Wallace, who's going to talk to us about his chapter in this book that he's editing. And David, somewhat rashly, I think, has taken on the topic of England. So we're all agog to hear what David is going to choose as national epics of England. So please welcome back David Wallace. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I think you'll still be agog at the end of the presentation. But,
I'm sure I will be.
And I wasn't my own first choice to write the England chapter, but I ended up writing it. There we are, the England chapter. Thought I might start here, which is where my mother lives, just outside Weston-super-Mare, in a little village called Uphill. And you can see two flags proudly flying there. You can identify them. They've got the Ukrainian flag and above them, and they've got a very strong commitment to Ukrainians, actually. The people who actually financed the renovation of the pier have actually given over an entire hotel to Ukrainian refugees, houses 50 of them. And above that, the Welsh flag. And this is the Church of St. Nicholas. Often you get a Church of St. Nicholas on cliffs. You can just see the spire there. And just, this is my little tribute to Mapping the March. Even every locale seems to have something to say. So Uphill, this is from Wikipedia, so it must be true, is a village and formal civil parish, now the parish of Weston-super-Mare. The manor is recorded in Domesday Book as Upon Peel, which derives from the Old English Upon Peel, meaning above the creek. Peel, and this is, if you click on the Peel here, is also rendered in various ways, is a Welsh place name element. The name is defined as the tidal reach of a waterway suitable as a harbour, and is common along the Bristol Channel and Severn Estuary. The highly localised distribution suggests may be part of a common maritime culture on the waterways within the tidal reach of the Seven Seas. So you've got a real mapping the borders issue right there in this little. I remember telling my father that Uphill had strong Welsh connections. He didn't believe it. He said, "No, it's uphill." Right. So, yeah. So there's been a tremendous amount of debate and soul searching about what English identity can be all about in the last 5 years, including this very successful stage play about Gareth Southgate and his kind of gentler form of manhood in trying to organise the team and trying to elicit from them what they thought it meant to be English. And he tried all sorts of things like talking about the Battle of Waterloo. And there's a wonderful actor plays Harry Kane. I think he's Australian, but there's a pause and Harry Kane says, "Who won?" Anyways, but I think it's all symptomatic of the fact there's a deep confusion about what it means to be English today. For example, the British Museum, British Museum, to what extent is this English or British or what is it exactly? See all the world's crowds going in, see the frieze there, a kind of oblique reference to the frieze, the Parthenon frieze that the Greeks want back. And my brother rather wittily observed, he said, well, we've got all these people who are being bag searched on the way in, surely they should be bag searching the curators on the way out, you know, that's, but again, a sense of crisis there, and what is the British Museum going to do with all these objects and artifacts assembled from throughout the world, the Benin bronzes and all the rest of it. So if you strip England down to its own culture, what happens is England continually invokes other cultures, borrows from other cultures, presents other cultures as itself and as its own, right? I think that's the dynamic that takes place. And the person who's critiqued this most energetically is Tom Nairn, a Scottish Marxist who ran the Blue Left Review for many years with Perry Anderson. But he is a Scottish Marxist who then became a very strong Scottish nationalist and challenges the English to say, okay, you formed an identity, continuing nicking and borrowing from other cultures. You take that away, what are you exactly, right? What is Englishness? So for a series of works, he's really articulated that very strongly. So it's a tough question. No wonder people didn't want to write the chapter, right? So one answer, I think, was beautifully finessed by Danny Boyle's design production for the 2012 Olympics. And it's typical English mishmash. I guess mishmash is a word that comes up a lot when you think about English identity. Where you have Glastonbury Tor with its strong Arthurian associations, but as we've just heard, of course, Arthur isn't really English at all. And out of the Tor, you get these Victorian industrialists pouring out to create a nation which was the most wealthy nation in the world in 1870, the most powerful. And out of that, you get Kenneth Branagh, who's actually from Belfast, making a speech out of The Tempest. So it's a very, I mean, it's a very bizarre presentation of a nation. And in a sense, it was a very clever response to Beijing 2008, where you had 56 children coming in wearing the 56 forms of ethnic dress of the peoples who make up China, carrying a national flag, which is then handed over to the army, which is run up the flagpole, sense there of a kind of unity. Although one of my students last week pointed out that all 56 children were in fact Han Chinese. They weren't actually Koreans and Mongolians, they were just all of one ethnicity. But there was a very strong and powerful, resolute sense of what China was all about. China is a nation, although the very idea of China as a nation was an idea again supplied by the West after 1912, that there is such a thing that is China, through a kind of imposition of or adaptation of Western theory of nationhood. The English, I think, have reacted to that by going for quirkiness, mishmash. This is how it seems to be finessed, this particular question. And then, of course, there have been various attempts to define Englishness along the centuries, including the early English text society. What are the foundational texts of our particular English culture? The progression from Old English, Middle English, Modern English, again, started in the High Victorian period. And then, of course, genealogical chronicles. This is one we actually have at the University of Pennsylvania, acquired about 20, 30 years ago, called, I think it's called Roll 1066. One of our librarians with a quirky sense of humor, right, calling it 1066. And a presentation from the Garden of Eden, which you can see in the roundel, down to Edward IV. And so there's a configuration here of an evolving national identity. So here you can see Aeneas, the journey of Aeneas from Troy and Brute to Britain. King Arthur and his descendants, where you get a line of descent which suddenly ends and then gets taken up again with a multiplication of different peoples coming in, which is a consistent motif in thinking about English identity, the addition, the invasion of various other peoples that become part of the mix. The text actually is Geoffrey of Monmouth, actually, that's written all the way there. Our graduate students have transcribed it and studied it. Just to focus on the multiple strands. And this is William the Conqueror, so we can see the stripe coming in from the side. And this relative confusion of a nation trying to create itself out of multiplicities is beautifully imaged in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, where Nerissa says, "What say you then to Falconbridge, the young Baron of England, one of the suitors of Portia? You know, I say nothing to him, for he understands not me, nor I him." The barrier of the English language, which of course was acute until the 19th century. English was not really much understood outside England until the 19th century. He hath neither Latin, French, nor Italian, and you'll come into the court and swear that I have a poor pennyworth in the English. Here's a proper man's picture, but alas, who can converse with a dumb show? How oddly he is suited. I think he bought his doublet in Italy, his round hose in France, his bonnet in Germany, and his behaviour everywhere. So, another kind of monumental text along the history of thinking about Englishness is this famous The True-Born Englishman by Daniel Defoe from 1701, heading towards the Act of Union, but also, of course, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 that put a Dutchman on the throne. And so he gives this marvelous account of where the English come from. Infused between a Saxon and a Dane, while their rank daughters to their parents just received all nations with promiscuous lust. This nauseous brood directly did contain the well-extracted blood of Englishmen. And perhaps the key line really, the Western Angles, all the rest subdued in England, a bloody nation, barbarous and rude, who by the tenure of the sword possessed one part of Britain and subdued the rest. And as great things denominate the small, the conquering part gave title to the whole. The Scot, Pict, Briton, Roman, Dane submit, and with the English Saxon all unite. And these the mixture have so close pursued, the very name and memory subdued. No Roman now, no Briton does remain. Wales strove to separate, but strove in vain. The silent nations undistinguished fall, and Englishman's the common name for all. Fate jumbled them together, God knows how. Whate'er they were, they're true-born English now. So this, of course, expresses the frustration of everybody else in the room, right? The people interested in Wales, Ireland, Scotland. But this is his view in 1707, which of course can be spun in a positive way, because if England is this multiplicity, right, then indeed it can, if you're part of the multitude, you can take your share of Englishness. So the fact that Carol Phillips from the Caribbean goes to Oxford, does his BA, does his Anglo-Saxon, and realizes that if English is such a promiscuous mix, he can be as much English as anybody else. And then there's been this Black British Voices project, collecting contemporary versions of Englishness along those lines. Brief history which we've touched on already, the Union of the Crowns and the Act of Union, and then Scotland's recent history. The first Scottish independence referendum, UK leaves the EU, Scotland votes to stay, and optimistically for Kate, I've put up 20XX, the second Scottish independence referendum, right? And so, like other contributors, you think about what are the candidates for a national epic, and so we review some of them. Well, Bede, given in Latin with Anglo-Saxon written into the two earliest manuscripts. Geoffrey of Monmouth, we heard as a possible candidate for Wales, I think rather firmly rejected by Helen, even though there is a Welsh language version, which you've studied, I think in Pennsylvania, right? Wace's Roman de Brut, written in Jersey, and Lacobon's Brut. Chaucer's Troilus and Crusader, with London as New Troy. And even, maybe for add, we could say, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an English national epic. It's a beautifully rounded, circular text about the foundation of the nation. Of course, in a form of English which did not become mainstream. Chaucer's does become mainstream because it's closer to Chancery standard. Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, about the famous English hero Arthur. But I think you can really do a lot of thinking with Malory, actually. I've done a lot of thinking with Malory in the course of the chapter. About, in a sense, the impossibility of the attempt to create an English nation, the disintegrating tendency of that very enterprise. Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, there's always people seeing a gap in the market. It's like continually people say, well, there hasn't yet been an English national epic, let's try and supply one. And even with, think about Beowulf, we've got just one extended, longer, heroic poem in Old English. That's all we've got. A lot of weight lays upon Beowulf, set in Denmark about Danes. Our Iran author in the national epics rather makes fun of this, says that's your national epic, doesn't ever mention England. My Iranian epic mentions Iran 1,600 times, right? Right. Of course, written in Ireland, of course, the Fairy Queen. John Milton's Paradise Lost, which becomes, because of its classical pedigree, paradigmatic of some people's idea of what epic is like, right? But I mean, Milton is eccentric in many ways as a, you know, in his theology. Blake is also idiosyncratic in his theology. He sort of invents his own kind of cosmology. So Chaucer, there was an attempt to kind of institutionalize Chaucer, make him respectable, give him a kind of royal lineage in the 17th century. But of course, he's Catholic. He lays across a divide. And there's also a need to, because he's across the Catholic divide, to emphasize how difficult Chaucer is, and therefore how much he requires glosses and interpretations. And Megan Cook has done very interesting work on this particular phase with Chaucer. And coming back to Malory, this is Arthur Rackham's extraordinary, a children's author, but his illustrations for Malory are amazing. This is the climactic battle of the Morte d'Arthur, which leads to the extinction of, you know, the knightly class. And of course, it's being written at the time of the extinction of the nobility in England. So it's an extraordinary text. And the Winchester manuscript is discovered in the 1930s, and great excitement, because the 1930s we've already heard about is a crucial time thinking about nationalism. We heard that with the Welsh example. And there are lots of people who want to edit this new manuscript. And the winning candidate is Vinava, who actually comes via France from Russia. But another person who wanted to edit the Morte d'Arthur is actually Lawrence, E.E. Lawrence of Arabia. And he actually shows up at Winchester and talks to various people saying that he'd like to be the editor of Malory, Morte d'Arthur. And they say, well, we think this Vinava chappie is a little better qualified than you. But he's an enormous enthusiast for Malory. He carried Malory with him in his saddlebags when he was on campaigning in the Arabian theatre of war. So they allow him to design a roundel to commemorate the war dead of Winchester College. And they showed me, more or less wrote it on the back of an envelope, which somebody's got in a desk drawer at Winchester. And this is the design he came up with. And it's a war in which 500 boys from Winchester died, which is like a year's entry. Reviewed Spencer. Again, he sees a need for a national epic. He's seeing a need for one, which he writes in Ireland. He gets burned out by the Irish. Seamus Heaney has things to say about that later. Blake, quirky. Then we come to the Victorian period, and the burning of the old Houses of Parliament creates a kind of artistic opportunity to furnish the Queen's robing room with paintings illustrative of English national epic history. And so William Dyce is recruited by Prince Albert, and they have a conversation on the Isle of Wight. And Prince Albert says, well, we have a national epic, the Nibelungenlied. What's your equivalent? And Dyce says, well, I guess it's Malory, the Morte d'Arthur, and says, well, can you prepare some drawings we can show the Queen? So they do. And the Queen looks at them, she says, oh, too much popery, too much adultery. So if you go to the Queen's robing room now, you see these rather indeterminate scenes from Malory where nothing much is happening, no identifiable scenes. It's almost like Malory processed through the Pilgrim's Progress. It's like very bizarre. So there's something about Malory that doesn't work there. Then we have to think about Sir Walter Scott, the Scotsman who invented England. Massively memorialized in Scotland at Waverley Station. It's the Waverley novels, of course, that give a rationale for Scotland in a later period. And Ivanhoe is perhaps the text that's most strongly associated with his theory about the evolution of Englishness. And you notice here, the real epic of our age, Victor Hugo, great admirer, and it was massively influential across the whole of Europe. Principally, I think, between the principle that Kate's already talked about, the reconciliation of two hostile elements internally, right? Which in Kate's, I think, understanding is that reconciliation was never quite made for Scotland, never achieved for Scotland, but it was exported to the world, this idea that you can create a nation from two internally warring factions, that you create a new kind of reality. Victor Hugo, apropos, is our France author, has rejected the idea that the Chanson de Roland really is now the epic of France. He turns his back on it in favour of Victor Hugo, is the real epic author for France now. And certainly his novels are of epic, gigantic length. Outside, you can see a very popular author, Ivanhoe, Walter Scott. And here is you all know this, the famous statement about the reconciliation of Norman and Saxon elements in Ivanhoe. This little phrase here, the far more manly and expressive Anglo-Saxon, that's a really phrase that lodges in the mind of certain thinkers in the 1930s, that Anglo-Saxon is manly and French is effeminate, right? And Romance culture is generally more effeminate. And there's still a strong kind of preference for the Anglo-Saxon side of English identity than there is for the suspect Mediterraneanism of the Romance side. So that's a very interesting quirk that runs through English thinking. So the gradual formation of a dialect compounded betwixt the French and the Anglo-Saxon. So, as I say, this idea of reconciliation of conflicting elements, you could even map this onto, say, Vietnam, where you've got the North and the South on that long, skinny country, are strongly differentiated, the harmonization of opposites, the United States in various ways, the North and the South. So, but I also want to mention, how is this achieved in Ivanhoe? There's achieved with a catalyst element, where you've got Isaac of York, who finances the armor through which, with which Ivanhoe will fight the Norman knights at a tournament and be the champion of Rowena, the Saxon princess, and of the downtrodden people. The armor is financed by Isaac of York, and then when Ivanhoe gets himself seriously wounded, the expertise to actually save him from death and nurse him back to health again is done by Rebecca, his daughter. And these are vital elements to the evolution of the nation, or the survival of Ivanhoe, but they cannot actually survive in England. And so when I have thinking about Jewish identity, is really an interesting case, because the idea of nationhood is, of course, developed through the Bible. The Israel author has chosen the book of Exodus, which is a very interesting text about nationalism, in which the nation doesn't behave particularly well, but nevertheless is a nation. Jewish figures in national epics often figure in this way, that they're vital to actually make things work, but they cannot be contained in the polity at the end. As you know, there were Jewish people were expelled from England in 1290 and didn't return to the 1650s. And so at the end of the novel, it sees them move out. And just, it's really interesting how much English readers were sentimentally afflicted by the final expulsion of Isaac and Rebecca. And there are all sorts of plays made of happy endings for Rebecca staying in England, maybe marrying Ivanhoe or something like that. Movies made and such like that. So thinking again about the 1930s, Tolkien and Lewis, I think, have had the most powerful and influential medievalists of the 20th century, no doubt. Both entering into this thinking, firstly, C.S. Lewis, thinking about what Chaucer really did to Il Philostrato, an essay that's been the bane of my life ever since I did my thesis, still is the first essay you find in the latest Norton anthology, an edition of Troilus and Cressida, where he expresses his dislike of all things Latin, the Latin spirit, which in all ages, except perhaps our own, has made English a little uncomfortable. The hero must be a lady killer from the very beginning, or the audience will think him a milksop and a booby. to abash whoever temporarily these strutting Latinisms, these Italians with tight trousers, right, coming into our country as the Velostraders coming into our culture, right? It's a threat, this Italian text. Is not least among the virtues of medieval Howandies. You notice we would say courtly love, but he wants the Germanic term, Howandies, who are native to that. Oh, sorry.
You've changed the slide. You need to go back to.
It went forward.
I went forward. Okay. Okay, yeah. This would never do. Which means say Latinism, Romance side of things will never do. We prefer the Germanic. And what he does at the end of the essay, this paragraph is quite cut, often cut. He attacks Marie Stopes, talking here about birth control clinics, and D.H. Lawrence, by quoting, almost like holding up a cross, the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf in the original, right? So like I thought this through once, and the teeming marshlands of the late D.H. Lawrence, whose depth the wisest knows not, and on whose bank the heart gives up its life rather than plunge in. And if you do plunge in, you find Grendel's mother, right? It's you know, very complicated. And then also Tolkien's famous essay on Beowulf, which Seamus Heaney acknowledges a lot too, talks about the older southern imagination has faded forever into literary ornament. The northern has power, as it were, to revive its spirits, even in our own times. And Beowulf has essential kinship with our own. So strong cultural preference for the Germanic rather than the Latin Romance side of Englishness. And he sees a gap in the market. There has been no English national epic. Let me write one, or let me write a trilogy. So Lord of the Rings is a product of that. Now this is a famous photograph of the Sutton Hoo discovery. And this is done by Mercy Lack, who, with a Leica camera, recorded the discovery. And of course, this is a unique photo because once you remove the planks and the mud won't survive for very long. This is the beautiful impression in the mud of the discovery of Sutton Hoo. And this is 1939, very late. And in the making of the movie, quite recently, you take away the fact that it was two women photographers traveling together who actually produced that beautiful artwork. Instead, you're solidly within a heterosexual matrix here with Carey Mulligan and Ralph Fiennes. And this, of course, is about the discovery in 1939. And by that stage, the Germanic suddenly was not fashionable. So what they did to the what they discovered at Sutton Hoo is actually buried it in the London Underground for the duration of the war, somewhere near Aldgate, because suddenly things German or Germanic were no longer quite so acceptable. And it didn't come out until quite a few years after the war. So, but Germanicness, the preference for the Germanic, I think, has been a strong and enduring strain through educated university Englishness, culminating in this famous debate of 2001. Sort of Anglo-Saxon prose, including the epic Beowulf, has been compulsory for first-year students at Oxford for more than a century. And there was a big debate about it. And finally, it was possible not to study Anglo-Saxon. So this is a picture to dwell upon. You know, you've got the best manuscript of the Song of Roland is, of course, at Oxford, ironically, right? In Anglo-Norman, so it's an English text. And then you've got Beowulf. And so you've got a balance of the two, but it's always been the preference for the Germanic. There's one out above interest or engagement with the French. And then the last step, I suppose, in the Beowulf sequencing is of course, Seamus Heaney, who, about the time of the great controversy over the compulsoriness of Beowulf at Oxford, does his own translation. And very cleverly, as he said, puts his sort of Celtic Ulster fingerprints on the English national epic, puts a Bourne into Beowulf, if you like, introduces Ulsterisms, reminds us of alternative histories there. And I think it's one of the greatest acts of cultural revenge and cultural theft in literary history, because he's really removed Beowulf from its status as an English national epic and put it into world literature, which is where Beowulf is now read. Because he always says it is a great, great poem. I agree with Tolkien, it's a great poem, but let me give it to you in my version, and it's now read universally in his version. So I do have an answer to what is the English national epic, but I'm not going to disclose today what that is. You'll have to buy the books, the 3 volumes. But I'm going to end by a little jump to the very end of the chapter. So I'm going to read you just 2 pages of what I've actually written. But here I think I am very much in sympathy with Geraint, right? The Great War revives Mallory, albeit with emphasis on mass mort rather than courtly aventure. Ultimately, 1914-1918 remains an epic and ultimately global event, too great for artistic capture. I do think the Great War is the last of England. I really do think that's everything else has been a playing out from 1914-1918. Niche modernists like David Jones deploy the deep history of English and British mythic literature in fragmented form. And we can argue for him as an English poet, London poet, both those things. J.R.R. Tolkien and also C.S. Lewis, Great War survivors who never again wished to cross the Channel, repurpose such fragments as alternative imaginary worlds, comfort for the shires. The broader English public has inherited great expectations from the Victorians, and going back to Danny Boyle's representation, while lacking increasingly the material means to fulfill them. That's our tragedy 101, I think, right now. That's what we're suffering from, isn't it? Right? Who then might reconcile this long insular pageant with the ever-changing exigencies of the present? That's where I do my reveal, but I'm going to cut to my last paragraph or somewhere near. A recent poet of Warwickshire, Zafar Kunyal, is completely English, a double identity. His mother is English from the Midlands and his father from the hill country of Kashmir, now living in Lahore. The memories that seem to hold me most, said Kunyal in 2019, are in green pockets, in gardens, parks, bits of woodland. In 2022, 10 years after Boyle's Olympian Isles of Wonder, he published England's Green, its title riffing on Blake's Jerusalem, but also on Hubert Parry's setting of it from 1916. It was originally written for the ultra-nationalist Fight for Right campaign by Parry, but then redirected by Parry to the National Union of Women's Suffragist Societies. Kunyal knows Parry's Jerusalem well, since it is sung before England cricket matches. England's Green divides into 2 parts, in and out. England from this collection opens with an epigraph from Little Gidding. History is now in England, and tells of when my back had felt heavy as England, that is, during his second and final trial for Warwickshire, a bearing staff on my jumper. Green, the next poem, opens with green she is when I find her, that is, his mother or her grave, in the poem finding points of orientation on Wake Green Road, where Tolkien lived, and from the mostly missing forest of Arden. Invasive from England's Green divides between 1616, the year Shakespeare died, and when a Turkish ship first brought conkers to England, and 1066, when William the Conqueror steps off his ship and falls flat on his face, history in pieces. And I'll leave you with this image of Zafar Kunyal's collection, England's Green, which I commend to you all. Thank you.